Hello, good evening. Welcome to Novara Live. My name is Aaron Bastani. This evening, I have the immeasurable pleasure of being joined by Helena, aka NoJusticeMTG. Helena, how are we?
Not doing too bad at all. Off to Greece tomorrow, so looking forward to that. But one more look into politics before I go away.
Don't smash too many plates while you're over there. I'll try not to do that, by the way, on Thursday. We'll be streaming that debate here on Novara Media. I won't be doing it because I'm enjoying myself, but because I will be perplexed, angered, outraged at the poor caliber of political debate in this country. That's not a sentence, by the way, you'll ever associate with us here at Novara Media. We have a great show coming up tonight. New polling has just dropped with some interesting insights on the potential fate of Jeremy Corbyn post-election and a bleak outlook for the Tories. We'll also discuss the boycotting of book festivals. One centrist Guardian columnist is fed up with them, surprise, surprise. And some good news for Faiza Shaheen's independent campaign in Chingford and Woodford Green. Stay tuned for all of that. It's almost a certainty that on July the 5th, Britain will be waking up to Keir Starmer as the country's new Prime Minister. And with such a likelihood baked into this upcoming election, the Labour leader ought to face some tough questions from the public. This morning, he appeared on Nick Ferrari's LBC Breakfast Show to face a grilling from callers. It was, generally speaking, the kind of practiced appearance we've grown used to from Starmer, but there are still a few topics he clearly doesn't enjoy addressing. A caller, Graham, put this to him.
You were happy to serve in Jeremy Corbyn's shadow cabinet from 2016. Without the waffle about believing Labour wouldn't win the 2019 election, just give me a simple yes or no answer. Had Labour won the election in 17 or 19, would you have been happy to serve in the cabinet under Prime Minister Corbyn?
Well, I didn't think we'd win either of those, Graham. There's no getting away from that. And certainly,
just a simple yes or no. If you were part of the shadow cabinet, would you have been happy to serve in his cabinet if he won?
Well, Graham, it's a pure hypothetical. Didn't cross my mind because I didn't think we would win. But let me just,
So you campaigned for him because you thought you wouldn't win?
Look, I campaigned for Labour because I've campaigned for Labour in every election, and I wanted good colleagues to be returned. People
but
like
had they won,
Bridget.
Graham's is a fair point. Had they won, would you have accepted a post in Mr Corbyn's cabinet?
I don't think we were going to win. I don't think anybody thought we were going
very bright
to win.
Man. You know that's not answering the question, Sir Keir. Had they been successful, would you have taken a cabinet post?
Look, Nick, it's a hypothetical. I didn't think we would win. I did take a post. Look, I served for 3 years in the shadow Brexit role because I thought that was a very important issue for our country.
But would you have followed him into government?
Look, it's hypothetical. If we got it over the line, but because I didn't think it would happen. But look, if we'd got it over the line, there were important things that I thought needed to be done from the front bench to continue and complete on the Brexit work, to make it absolutely clear that the Labour Party never deviated from our position on NATO, and to do the necessary work on anti-Semitism. But Nick, as we went into that 2019 election, I genuinely did not think, and I think I wasn't alone in this, that Labour would win that election.
This is one of the most insane clips of Keir Starmer, I think, actually, that we've seen in response to this question so far. Several things. Firstly, he says, we were never going to be in government, but I served as Brexit secretary because I thought that was important. Why is it important if you're literally never going to be in government? What? How? Why? Makes no difference, surely. And then he says, if we had got over the line, I would have, been there because of Brexit and anti-Semitism and NATO. So what he's saying is Jeremy Corbyn might have formed the Labour government, the most radical government arguably in this country's history, and he would have been part of child poverty reduction, building houses, climate change. What's the political agenda? What's the stuff that gets Keir Starmer up in the morning? Well, he just said it. Staying in NATO, although leaving NATO was never part of Labour's manifesto in 2019. Anti-Semitism. Nobody was for anti-Semitism. And Brexit. Okay. And also, people are saying 2017 and 2019, Labour got 40% in 2017. The Tories got 42%. 1% goes the other way. Labour forms a government. So this idea that Labour could have never formed a government in 2017, just complete nonsense. Of course, Starmer says he wouldn't have served in a Corbyn government, even though he now says he fundamentally disagreed with the former leader and disliked that manifesto. He was there or thereabouts at the time, we know that. So let's look at Keir Starmer in 2019 and let's see him saying, in his own words, how he didn't think Labour would win and why the manifesto is bad.
And that's why it's so important that we build on our 2017 manifesto, which is what we'll do, to a 2019 manifesto that's even better. So let's go out, let's fight for it. Are you up for it? Yeah! Are you up for it? Yeah!
The poor quality audio there just does it for me. It has a real meme quality. By the way, if you had somebody like, "Are you up for it?" Can you imagine being in the trenches next to that guy in 1914, 1915, 1916, Battle of the Somme? You know, Major Starmer, are you up for it? Lads, we're dead, okay? It's been nice knowing you. I hope you've sent letters to your loved ones. The topic of the 2019 Labour manifesto also came up on LBC.
You described the Conservative manifesto as almost Corbyn-like, throwing everything in the wheelbarrow. It was uncosted. But James Schneider, who was Director of Strategic Communications, saw you in the room when it was effectively signed off. He told us that.
Nick, after the election, we had a leadership...
But the manifesto, you were there, you nodded, we are told, you nodded ahead with Jeremy Corbyn as that manifesto went through.
I was in the manifesto meeting because I was responsible for the Brexit section.
So you
and
agreed
only
to an
the Brexit
uncosted
section.
window wheelbarrow manifesto?
Nick, it was Jeremy Corbyn's manifesto. My manifesto is very, very different.
Nick, I'm not suggesting it's not.
No, but Nick, after the event, after we lost that badly, we did have a sort of soul-searching in the Labour Party. And amongst the reasons, we actually did a report on this that was commissioned for me, and one of the things that was very, very clear coming back from the voters was we didn't think that this manifesto was deliverable because there was too much in it and it didn't seem credible, even though some of the policies people liked.
Do you know what was least deliverable, Keir? Another referendum on the European Union and membership of the European Union, with people in Labour having wildly different opinions. Labour would campaign to stay in, but Jeremy Corbyn would take a seat back. This was all set and driven by you. That was the most outlandish thing. But of course, that had all the good things of Keir Starmer, all the bad things are other people. We know that. We know that. And he was in that meeting, by the way. It's called a Clause 5 meeting, which sets the Labour Party manifesto. He was in that meeting because he was a member of the shadow cabinet. In this country, we have something called collective responsibility with regards to cabinet and shadow cabinet. But again, apparently it was Jeremy Corbyn's manifesto, even though Corbyn didn't want the position on Brexit. And of course, party conference made lots of policy, but it's Jeremy Corbyn's manifesto. People liked a lot of the policies from the 2019 manifesto. According to YouGov polling in November that year, most respondents supported rent controls, higher taxes on the rich, including wealth taxes, and some nationalisation and free national broadband. And yet none of those appear in Labour's 2024 manifesto, dropped recently. But they did inform Starmer's 2020 leadership pledges. Are those the ones almost completely abandoned once he'd won control of the party? Ferrari pressed him on his record of breaking promises.
This is what some people would say gives you the nickname of the flip-flop or Captain Flip-Flop, because I take you back to your pledges when you were running to be leader in 2020. You talked about nationalisation of rail, mail, water. Was that a promise made in bad faith?
No, it wasn't. But
so without COVID in Ukraine, you'd have done it?
Look, we got 5 years have passed pretty well since then. The world has changed, the economy has changed, and my job was to drag our party towards the country, so we could always say country first, party second. So what I've done, Nick, is to look at everything that we've put on the table previously and say, does it pass my test now, which is country first, party second? On nationalisation, since you raised it, I mean, when we had the energy bills going through the roof 2 years ago, I said to my team, we've got to do something because this is for individuals and families and businesses, this is going to ruin them. And we looked at a windfall tax, which gave a yield. And then I said, mock up how much it would cost to renationalise energy versus cutting the bills by putting in place a cap on the bills. We could have then, and I got them both mocked up. The choice then was to use the money 2 years ago in the middle of this crisis to pay off the shareholders. And my team told me we can do that, but that means you can't lower a single bill for any individual or business across the country. Or you can scrap that and argue for a cap so people's bills are capable of being paid. Now, that But common sense is a big part of my politics. I wasn't going to say, because 3 years earlier I'd said something about nationalisation, I'm afraid we're going to pay off the shareholders and not reduce bills on people who can't afford their bills.
Okay.
And that's a practical sort of common sense approach.
So those 10 pledges, scrap tuition fees, scrap the House of Lords, renationalise. Are you Groucho Marx? Those are my principles, and if you don't like them, I have some others.
No,
Are you the Groucho Marx of politics?
I had to pick up my party after the worst election since 2019, turn it inside out and change it.
The worst defeat since 2019. Keir, that doesn't even make sense. The defeat was in 2019. And anyway, you played a part in it. I hate this so much. It's like a small child refusing to take responsibility for their actions, except this man is 60, 61, and he's about to be the Prime Minister. And nobody in the media, barely anyone in the media says this is absolutely ridiculous. Grow up, man. Be a man and take some responsibility for things that you were collectively involved in the past. But it's being aided and abetted by the media class, this complete disavowal from things he actively pushed. So Starmer's saying there that economic circumstances are what led him to abandon a pledge like nationalising energy firms. Of course, as Ferrari points out, that was far from the only pledge he scrapped. But if he's blaming a poor economy for making him drop the promises, does that mean he still believes in the principles behind those promises? In order to get an answer to that question, we have to go to a BBC Radio 4 interview from last month, where Michelle Hussain asked Starmer this.
Do you still believe in free university tuition?
Well, I certainly believe that we've got to change the current arrangements because I don't think they're fair. And obviously abolishing tuition fees is one way of achieving that.
It's one you believed in 2020, isn't it?
Well, yes, I did, and that's why I said it. But since then, there's been huge damage to the economy. And as we've got towards the election, we've had to make difficult choices.
Yeah, I understand that. I'm just that's why I'm kind of thinking longer term. If you do secure the highest sustained growth in the G7, could you go back to that?
Yeah, I want you to hear me out because actually understanding who I am, it does require sort of in what way do I make decisions. So what I've decided is that against the economic damage that's been done, we have to be clear that we will only make commitments going into this election that we know we can fulfil. Looking at the costing for tuition fees or abolishing them, looking at the money we need to put into the NHS, I've taken the decision we can't do both. Now, that's a difficult decision. I'll accept that. Some people will say you're going back on one but not the other, but we can't have both.
Fine. That's a bit of so-called pragmatism. But there was still no answer about principle. Michelle Hussain tried again.
I'm interested in your beliefs because I think most people understand there's a difference between what you will promise to do now or in a couple of weeks in your full manifesto and what your core beliefs are, what you would do if you get to that position on economic growth. Would you scrap the two-child benefit cap?
Well, in an ideal world, of course, but we haven't got the resources to do it at the moment. What I will do, because child poverty is something I'm absolutely set against. The last Labour government had an anti-child poverty strategy, and we managed to do a huge amount of good stuff on child poverty. We will do the same thing and have a child poverty strategy. But there are other elements to it. I mean, if you look across the country, particularly in my constituency in London, child poverty and housing are tied up together. Child poverty and the cost of living and the way the economy is run are tied up together. All of that needs to be brought together.
But you see, this particular policy,
I accept it's a challenge we'll have to rise to.
Okay, but this particular policy is one I'm sure you would acknowledge that is causing real hardship for families. Scottish Labour is against it. Gordon Brown is against it. People, again, might understand that the world is never likely to be ideal, but if you secured the highest sustained growth in the G7, which is one of those core missions, would you do it?
Well, in an ideal world, we'll be able to do that. And we do. I mean, I'll be clear, we want to grow the economy so we can
when is the world
absolutely
ideal?
Put the money where it's needed. But I do think it's important just to take a moment to appreciate the damage that's been done to the economy.
If in doubt, blame Liz Truss. Not a lot of evidence there that Keir Starmer has any principles or political commitments, except in a fictional ideal world, which, by the way, we don't live in. But if we don't know the background principles guiding his politics, how can we trust Keir Starmer on any pledge about the future? After all, everything would otherwise be disposable. He wouldn't believe in anything. Here's how Starmer managed when a topic involving actual matters of principle came up this morning on LBC.
Israel's been put on a blacklist of countries that harm children during conflict. Will you stop British arms being sold to Israel immediately?
Well, Annie, so far as arms are concerned, there are a number of licences that allow arms to be sold to Israel. They need to be reviewed. The government has, in fact, got legal advice on this in relation to what's being sold and what it's being used for. We've asked the government for access to that advice. They're not going to give it, and we're in an election now, so I'm not expecting it. But if we get over the line, we will look at that.
So you can't make a decision without looking at legal advice on selling arms to Israel?
Nick, it depends what is actually being exported. Let me give you an example. If something is being exported for purely defensive reasons, you've seen the Iran attack on Israel. That is materially different to something which is being used, let's say, in a Rafah offensive.
What they do with their missiles? Well, this is sell them.
Well, Nick, what happens with these licences, because the government hasn't given me access to their review, which is fair enough, but I have access to the process. Each licence is reviewed one by one, what is within this licence.
So you wouldn't ban
and what it has been. We'll do the review and look at it, but where it's being, look, on...
A lot of reviews going on.
Well, Nick, no, this is taken really seriously in government. Each licence is looked at one by one. And in the past, decisions have been made not to sell arms to Israel. And where that's necessary, that's a decision that we would take.
We'll have a review and a consultation and a commission. This is Starmer's strategy, right? He bores you to sleep with every answer he gives to a question. Will you sell weapons to Israel? Well, we'll have a review of the licenses. And there are reviews of the licenses and we're selling the weapons. Do you agree or disagree with what's going on? He has to depoliticize absolutely everything and make it about law and process. And that's fine if you're a lawyer, if you're a bureaucrat. The point is, Keir, you want to be the prime minister. You can't avoid the politics when you want to be the most powerful politician in the country. Israel's conduct in Gaza came up again.
Abby in Paddington, does Sir Keir Starmer agree with the use of the word genocide?
In what sense?
I imagine in Gaza, the Israel committing genocide in Gaza.
Well, look, I've said repeatedly, Israel has to exercise its right to self-defense within international law. No, Abby, and anyway, I'm not going to sit in an LBC studio and pronounce that something is either genocide or not. And I'll tell you for why, Nick.
Keir, you can't decide about the the weapons. I'm sorry, you can't decide about genocide. Why,
Nick? Allow me, please. In the fall of Yugoslavia, all sorts of atrocities were committed. I represented Croatia in the International Court for 3 months, where we argued about genocide. We reviewed 3 months' worth of evidence. At the end of that, the court itself then had to make a decision based on all of the evidence. That's how it works. Not politicians sitting looking at clips, bits of footage here and there and coming to decisions based on that. It has to be Israel, every country has to be held properly to account in accordance with international law, but the body that does that is the international court that's set up in order to do so. And having literally argued in court for 3 months over the meaning of genocide, the evidence of genocide, I'm very well aware of what it is. I'm also very, very well aware that you need to have the evidence in front of you before you come to a final decision.
There's, of course, one word that you can say in response to all of that. Russia. Keir Starmer is saying, I can't say whether this or that is happening with any kind of conclusive finality because, of course, I'm not there. I can't lambast and castigate and criticise from a lovely air-conditioned studio here in London, LBC. As the man who'll be the next Prime Minister, I couldn't possibly do that. It'd be ridiculous. That's precisely what you've been doing for years about Russia. Vladimir Putin's a war criminal. He's a war. By the way, Russia is waging an illegal war of aggression in Ukraine. That's what's happening, right? I don't need to hear, I don't need to read a 8,000-word executive summary from some document which is thousands of pages long to know that's happened. That has happened. And what we want to know as an electorate, faced with a man who will be the next prime minister, do you think what is happening in Gaza is genocide? You can say no, and you can explain why. Do you think? We're not saying give us the final legal edict, because of course that is beyond your control, beyond your power. Do you think? We are covering the election differently here at Novara Media because we're not funded by billionaires or oligarchs. We're supported by our audience, you. Yes, you, watching and listening. Make this show, this organisation possible. Really. It wouldn't exist without you. If you want to help us build a new media for a different politics, not the broken, boring one of Keir Starmer, and not the broken, sometimes captivating one, but also equally destructive one of Boris Johnson, then go to novaramedia.com/support. Help us build people-powered media. And if that's too hard to remember, the link is in the description below. Boris Johnson has been brought back onto the pitch by the floundering Conservative Party. Major Johnson reporting for duty, sir. According to The Telegraph, tens of thousands of letters signed by the former PM are due to be delivered to voters later this week. The Telegraph reports this. It comes after the Conservatives warned that a vote for reform risked putting Labour in power for a generation. The direct mail drive urging people to vote Tory is Mr Johnson's closest involvement yet in the Conservatives' attempts to defy the polls. Among those voters believed to have been targeted are wavering Tories who backed the party when Mr Johnson was leader, but are now tempted by reform. On Monday, the Conservatives issued their starkest warning yet over Nigel Farage's party after the Reform Manifesto launch, saying, quote, "If you're thinking about voting for reform and a generation under Labour scares you, there's only one way to prevent it. Vote Conservative." We're kind of getting a bit bored of the starkest warning yet. You can only do that a couple of times. You can't do it 3 days a week. Anyway, so what has happened looks relatively straightforward. Nigel Farage comes back, Reform polling improves, Reform launches its manifesto or contract, its polling gets even better, Conservative Party headquarters gets incredibly worried, and they proceed to press the big red Boris button. Indeed, over the last fortnight, there have been discussions about Mr Johnson appearing on the campaign trail to boost the party's fortunes, and that makes perfect sense. According to YouGov, Johnson is the most popular Conservative politician, yes really, and is as popular as Keir Starmer. So he still has that star quality among 2019 Tory voters anyway, which could get some MPs re-elected. He could be the difference. But in a sign that all of this is a last-minute, unplanned, desperate move from the Tories, it turns out this announcement comes while Boris Johnson, well, he's not even in the country. His wife, Carrie Symonds, posted a picture of them both on a sandy beach in Sardinia, alongside their 3 young children, on Instagram. The potential return of Boris Johnson was even discussed on the BBC's Politics Live show this afternoon, with Novara's very own Ash Sarkar on the panel.
My opening question to our panel, starting with you, Andrew Griffith, is would you like to see Boris Johnson back out on the campaign trail?
Well, goodness me, yes. This is a moment for all Conservatives to come out on the campaign trail. We're faced with a Labour government that's going to tax people's home, their pension, their savings. You know, now is the time for all good people to come to the aid of the party and get the country to wake up to the risk that we face.
Darren, would you like to see Boris Johnson back on the campaign trail?
Oh, I don't really care, to be honest. I mean, the chaos from the Conservatives is so mad now that they can't even get their own leader to lead their party. They want someone that was kicked out of Parliament for lying to come back and try and help steer the ship in the right direction. I mean, it's ridiculous, isn't it?
Well, as I say, what is ridiculous, actually, is to present to the country an agenda that's going to change the constitution so you can be in power for a generation, to not be truthful and honest about the tax rises that you're proposing.
We'll come on to that.
And I know you're a sensible person, so perhaps you'll tell us more about what the tax rises are going to be.
Boris Johnson, is it not ridiculous? You need a failed leader to come back because your current leader's too rubbish?
Well, as I say, it's great to have as many Conservative voices out there. This is a moment.
He's very good.
This is a moment when the country desperately needs to wake up to the impending risk of a Labour government, possibly with a supermajority.
Very good.
Why would a failed leader be on the campaign trail? Well, you could equally ask that question of Ed Miliband or Gordon Brown, Neil Kinnock, or indeed, with regards to the Tories, Theresa May, William Hague and Ian Duncan Smith in previous elections anyway. This whole thing of giving the Corbyn treatment to a leader who didn't win is very specific to your guy, Darren. It's not that typical. In fact, it's without precedent. Joe Coburn proceeded to pose the question to Henry Newman and our very own Ash Sarkar.
You used to work for Boris Johnson, didn't you, Henry? Would you like to see him out on the campaign trail?
I think we need the Conservative family back together on this campaign. I think it'd be great to have Boris Johnson out campaigning. But I also think Boris Johnson has been making the case of the danger that a Labour government would pose for the country. He's written in the Mail, in his column, about the tax rises that are inevitable with the Labour government. I think we have heard the Labour Party try to rule out some tax rises, not yet CGT rises.
Capital gains tax, yeah, we're going to get...
Capital gains taxes on small investors who would face huge increases in their investments and would encourage people to divest out of those investments.
I can't hold you back, can I? Any of you about the tax debate. But on Boris Johnson, what's the benefit?
Well, I think he's a campaigning superstar. Of course, Boris Johnson should be on the campaign trail.
Ash?
Are you going to pull the knives out of his back before you get him on telly again, or what? I mean, it's ridiculous. You defenestrated your own party leader. Right? No, so I'm talking about the Conservative Party more broadly. You defenestrated him because he was tanking in the polls because of his conduct while in office. And now you're going to stitch Charles I's head back on and sort of parade him around like a little puppet. It's a gimmick which reeks of desperation, quite frankly, and I can't wait to see it.
Henry Newman wants the Conservative family to just come together. I just want Mummy and Daddy to get along and stop fighting. Well, I'm afraid, little Henry, that Daddy isn't very reliable. He walked out a long time ago and he's found a new woman and is presently with his new family abroad. He's such a deadbeat, he isn't even paying child maintenance. And I think Ash Sarkar put it very well. This is the Conservative Party that ultimately did for Boris Johnson, removed him from office within a few years of winning a large majority, and now they want him to come back and to help a few of his former colleagues, some of them who put the knife in, over the edge. Helena, trust Ash, of course, to put things so well, but what do you think it says about the Tory party that they're publicising Boris Johnson, not on the campaign trail, not taking selfies, but having his signature on letters? Apparently, this is a story worthy of the Daily Telegraph.
I mean, it's desperation. That's clearly what it represents. It's the desperation of the Conservative Party. The Reform UK voters that they are losing usually kind of belong to the same kind of group of people who really supported Boris Johnson in quite a large way as part of their 2019 voter base. And of course, whilst there is plenty of a group of people who are part of this kind of cult of Boris Johnson, the hashtag Back Boris Brigade, that is a very small number of people they can potentially win over who might be a swing voter come the election this year. The issue, of course, is actually, I don't really think that Boris Johnson is that much of a vote winner outside of this very kind of small cadre of people who bought into him as a person, as a political figure, as this kind of this charismatic leader. I don't think it's a very small amount of people, especially now. And I think broadly, the UK is in general actually still views with Boris Johnson with a lot of very large disdain. Partygate was a giant scandal. People in this country really don't like people being treated unfairly. And we felt broadly treated very unfairly by the fact that this guy was partying whilst we were sitting at home, protecting ourselves, not even allowed to go to large-scale funerals with friends and family. And that really puts people off. So I don't think this is necessarily a particularly larger vote winner. And internally with the Conservative Party, I guess people did hate the stitch-up of Boris Johnson. But when it comes to the floating voters that they need to win over to shore up their base, I don't think that this is necessarily going to be something that actually draws in too much support. And what it does do, what it really clearly does do for me personally, is recognise that actually in 2019, the Conservative Party support wasn't entirely based around Boris Johnson as the person. It really wasn't. People voted for the Conservative Party in 2019 on the back of a bunch of manifesto commitments that they have completely ditched now. It was an anti-austerity platform with investment in hospitals, a green industrial revolution, with a conversion therapy ban, with uprating benefits in line with inflation, competing HS2, this high-wage, high-skill economy that we were promised from the 2019 manifesto, all of this interventionist state policy for the economy, and then they got rid of Boris Johnson, and all of that's been ditched. Rishi Sunak and Jeremy Hunt are running on a pro-austerity platform, slashing away literally all of those promises that were made to the electorate. Levelling Up has been an absolute failure to actually do what it said on the tin. And not only are the public, they're kind of a bit miffed at the idea that they could change prime ministers. But really and truly, the promises, the roaring 20s, as Tom Harwood promised us, and the Boris Johnson's manifesto promises, they've all been replaced with a kind of economic policy that nobody in this country wanted. And the Conservative Party really think this neoliberalism is going to win them voters. And really and truly, it wasn't just Boris Johnson that won them those votes in 2019. It was a policy that they were promised, and they don't exist anymore.
Basically, the Tory strategy now is, can we get 5% of the reform vote, or a fifth, I should say, really? Let's say 20% of the reform vote back. Can we do that? Well, yeah, that might save you 10, 15, 20 MPs. That's your strategy, really? I mean, it's desperate, right? There are some middle-class coded things which are just great. At least I think so. One is cream tea. Another is country pubs. There's Waitrose, free tea and coffee and M&S sandwiches. The chicken coronation really is sublime. I recommend it. But best of all are literary festivals. Generally taking place in the summer among idyllic surroundings, they see thousands of people converge to eat, drink and discuss books. So far, so harmless and utterly delightful. Well, not according to Fossil-Free Books. Just a few weeks ago, they organised a boycott of the Hay Festival, one of the world's leading literary get-togethers that happens every year at Hay on Wye. Now, one of the main sponsors of the festival is, or rather was, Baillie Gifford. They're an investment management firm managing more than, wait for it, £225 billion in assets. And according to Fossil-Free Books, they're accused of profiting from fossil fuels as well as, quote, Israeli apartheid occupation and genocide. Faced with that boycott from several authors, Hay suspended its sponsorship deal with Baillie Gifford. Then, Edinburgh International Book Festival, which had previously defended its sponsorship deal, did the same. At that point, the firm announced it would stop funding UK literary festivals altogether. That's a commitment presently worth around £1 million a year. Now, for Fossil-Free Books, this came as something of a surprise, not least because Baillie Gifford has fewer investments in hydrocarbons than similarly sized investment funds. Only 2% of the assets it manages are invested in fossil fuel companies, compared to an industry average of around 11%. Surely then, that would make their divestment away from fossil fuels easier. Apparently not, with the fund telling the Guardian newspaper this. We are managers of other people's money, not our own. We are not in a position to make exclusions of that nature based on our own ethical judgments or in response to pressure from outside groups. For their part, Fossil-Free Books have been surprised by the immediacy of their success. I wouldn't call it a victory, Omar Hamilton, one boycotter, told The Guardian. Another, author Guy Gunaratne, noted that several of the statements put out by festivals when their ties with Baillie Gifford were broken mentioned their positive relationship with the firm. He says, "It was that relationship that we were trying to get them to leverage in order to talk to them about divesting." This was meant to be the start of a conversation, a jumping off point it seems, but Baillie Gifford went straight into top gear. But whatever your views on the boycott and the subsequent response, one weapon that Fossil-Free Books have in their armoury is sneering liberals. Here's The Guardian's Marina Hyde speaking about Fossil-Free Books on the podcast The Rest is Entertainment.
One of the things that I particularly don't admire is the suggestion that everything is politics and that art is the same as politics. And that all art, by the way, some art is political and much art is born of its time and therefore can have that sort of relationship to politics. But it is art and politics are not the same. And if you insist that all art must be politicised and all artists must make statements all the time, then what you are essentially wishing for is a contraction of the human experience, a contraction of human possibility, because you're saying these things essentially semantically map onto each other. This is nonsense, okay? Art can exist just for its own sake. The pleasure of these things just for their own sake must be allowed to exist. When I think of these people, I think of them and I think they're the sort of people who'd been saying to Shakespeare, do you, William Shakespeare, condemn Elizabeth I's brutal suppression of the uprisings in Ireland? Do you? Why haven't you said anything? Why haven't you signed a letter saying anything? If you don't sign it, William Shakespeare, then this new play of yours, The Taming of the Shrew, we're going to protest this. You know, is it any good? And just feel that not everything has to involve someone saying, and they say, oh, you've got the luxury of that because you don't live in Gaza or whatever. This is, I'm afraid, throughout the whole of human history, awful things have been happening. But art must be allowed to exist in and of itself, and it doesn't have to answer any questions, and people should be allowed to come and listen to by the way, anyone you talk to at these book festivals say, if you want to hear people talking about these issues,
100%.
The best place to hear them is at these festivals. The thing that Baillie Gifford's funding at something like the Cheltenham Festival was being primarily directed towards now is the outreach programs for children. They will now go.
Yeah.
Okay. So these people have not thought anything through. And also they are that sort of modern thing that everything is politics and everything must be politicized is limiting, and it is a contraction of the mind. And it cannot be, things must be allowed to exist in and of themselves and not have to be politicized.
That was Marina Hyde there, daughter of Sir Alistair Edgecombe James Dudley Williams, 2nd Baronet, saying that not everything is political. And I mean, sure, not everything is political. My choice of socks this morning, that was not political. What I had for dinner last night, not really that political. Will I be walking the dog at some point this week when it's raining? Absolutely not political. But patronage of the arts and what constitutes legitimate sources of funding for them, well, that is absolutely, undeniably political. Yes, it always has been. The fact that the papacy funded much of the Renaissance is political. Picasso, Bauhaus, and Dickens are all very political people and movements. They're driven by very political ideals. These were people who cared about politics. And now that's not to say you cannot enjoy art and books if you don't have a PhD in their political and historical context. That's stupid. But this conversation is definitely a thing. It's not new. And on the issue of the boycott, I can genuinely see both sides of the argument. Though I can't see why Baillie Gifford couldn't at least offer a 10-year plan to fully divest from fossil fuels. It's 2% of their portfolio. And yes, we need to move beyond this stuff. But at the same time, it's fair to ask whether funding from, say, the British government, which is partially funded through tax receipts on oil and gas production, is any better. But back to Marina Hyde. Some art is political. Well, not all of it. How can art not be political? How can it not express certain ideas, values, and assumptions? And then, of course, there is the link between artistic patronage and war. This is from the Financial Times about one Zach Gertler. Individuals tend to receive less scrutiny because they're often one step removed from their investments. And nonetheless, students at London's Goldsmiths College are occupying the Centre for Contemporary Art, calling for the university to cut its ties with donors Candida and Zach Gertler. In 2019, Zach was reported to have hosted a birthday party for Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Little party. If you're hosting a birthday party for Benjamin Netanyahu, who I personally think is a war criminal, then yes, people are absolutely within their rights to boycott you, to say, we don't want your money funding this institution. Elsewhere in that same article, one interviewee talks about how abolishing non-dom status will impact the arts because apparently non-doms are great benefactors. I'm sure they are. They aren't paying any tax. And yes, making that point is political. Sorry, Marina. Helena, this is a really complex topic. And like I say, I understand arguments from both sides. But trust media liberals to make protesting against the literary festival sound like the end of days. What do you make of it all?
The optics are complex. The optics are certainly complex about what happens when issues of this magnitude get magnified, even more so by the fact that it impacts people's enjoyment of art. That's something that is optically difficult. I mean, part of protest, part of boycotts, part of being able to try and speak about the political ramifications of investments and the way in which that we engage in our consumption, that's always going to be able to make you enemies somewhere. And indeed, plenty of protests in this way have been well known to cause lots of issues. Look at how Just Stop Oil have been received by the public, and very negatively, of course. I can understand why people are frustrated, saying, well, now hang on a minute, why is all of these things happening to, that might impact these funding avenues for these kind of cultural things that I want to be able to enjoy. The optics are certainly complex, but the principle is super, super simple, right? You have investments in fossil fuels. We want people to divest from fossil fuels. The only way that we can do this, because clearly there is no market-driven reason for them to do so within their own set of material interests, right? If you are an investment firm, if you're someone who is using that investment firm and say like a blind trust, for example, like there is no reason within a market framework for them not to engage in the investment in fossil fuels because it is profitable. Like that's the one mechanic around capitalism that underpins all of it. You need to make profit. You need to make money. And things like the negative externalities of what happens when you invest in the fossil fuel industry is not taken account of within that singular framework. So there has to be a broader consensus in how we consume, in how we engage with those markets to try and force people who otherwise make profit-driven decisions to have their profits impacted otherwise, or have their position compromise in how people would engage with them within the market, which might impact their profits, to be able to make certain different business decisions that would otherwise be profitable for them. Look at, for example, the comparison with South African apartheid, right? You invest in South African apartheid, we boycott you to try and get you to stop. This is a super, super simple procedure. And it's very interesting that when it comes to things like climate change or, BDS with regards to Israel, a lot of the kind of liberal media journalists find it very, very uncouth when they would similarly have absolutely been supportive of any kind of boycott that went against apartheid South Africa. You know what the saying is? How most liberals will only care about the social battles of the past, the ones that have already been won, but anything that's happening at the moment they don't want to know about. And that's, I think, is indicative of a very kind of anti-youth bias amongst a load of kind of liberal journalist class in this country, where they look at a social issue that young people really care about, and they feel like they should take an opposite position because it seems to be a bit gauche for them to want to get involved in. And hence why you get these kind of ridiculous reactions like you saw from Main Hyde, as you say, treating something like removal of funding because of a boycotting principle as being like it's the end of days. And really and truly, it's upholding an incredibly simple principle that we need to exercise and we need to leverage to ensure that people divest from things that are net negative utility for society.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, there's a point about our culture now. It's clearly changed in the last 20 years because of social media, all kinds of things. I mean, it's not going away, by the way. It's here. And people are scrutinized in a way they simply weren't. Any kind of concentration of power or authority can be scrutinized in a way that it just simply was unthinkable 20 years ago. And that can be good, that can be bad. It's just the reality of where we are, right? That's inarguable. That's one point. We can have that discussion, very interesting. The second point is we need to move away from fossil fuels. And like you just said there, Helena, the return on fossil fuel projects is around 15-20%. The return on renewable projects is around 5%. And if you're trying to maximize shareholder returns, which these organizations do, by the way, that's why the state ultimately has to be involved. Boycotts only go so far. We need to move their investment towards renewable energy and away from fossil fuels. And that isn't going to happen through the profit motive. So what these people are trying to do is exercise cultural power, right? Cultural capital. They're trying to use the influence they have as people in that industry, as writers, as book workers, et cetera, publicists. And you can talk about whether or not, did they go too quickly, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Fine. Interesting conversation. But should there be a very clear political confrontation with regards to people that invest in fossil fuels, I think that's really hugely important, by the way, in what might be viewed as politically progressive social circles, like at literary festivals. Absolutely, that should be highlighted. Absolutely. And yes, that is political. And we cannot run away from it. You can't say that climate change is this huge issue and then say, oh, well, my literary festival is more important. I like literary festivals. I just said it. For me, it's up there with M&S Gold Tea and Waitrose sandwiches. Love it. But climate change is kind of a big deal, Marina. Jeremy Corbyn is running as an independent in the London constituency of Islington North. And, of course, he's doing so after current Labour leader Keir Starmer banned him from standing for the Labour Party. That ban seems to be something the British public and Labour voters in particular aren't happy about. And take a look at this polling from The Independent. More than half of voters want Jeremy Corbyn back in the Labour Party. New poll reveals. And more than half of all voters want to see Jeremy Corbyn back in the Labour Party if, and it's an important if, he wins his seats at the forthcoming election. Specifically, that's 56% of all voters saying Labour should let him back in if he's re-elected, and an astonishing 80% of Labour voters saying the same. Helena, what do you think explains this pretty surprising response?
I mean, voters like fair play. The UK, culturally, British culture is one of fair play. We saw that with the kind of response with regards to the Diane Abbott deselection or reselection, and with Faiza Shaheen, is that people in the public were really put off by it. Whether they liked Abbott and Shaheen or not, people thought that the foul play was symptomatic of something they didn't want to be associated with. And I think the same is probably true for someone with even worse public profile in terms of the people who do genuinely dislike him in terms of Jeremy Corbyn. They fundamentally look at Keir Starmer's Labour Party and go, this is foul play, this isn't fair. Because we know that Jeremy Corbyn has no power. Everybody knows he has no power in the Labour Party. It's clear to everybody the left have been excised from the party mechanism. So it makes no difference whether he's in the Commons or not. I think it broadly speaks to that level of fair play. And on top of that, when it comes to the Labour membership being massively in support of him, there's no surprise at all. This was a guy who won 2 leadership elections after they tried to get rid of him after the chicken coup. And even though the Labour right must understand how well liked he is within the party, because they did internal polling, Labour together did internal polling of the membership, and it's not full of like Jeremy Corbyn Trotskyist entries, because that was just a complete nonsense. That wasn't true that militant tendency has arisen from its grave to support Jeremy Corbyn and the Labour Party. And that was mostly just a bunch of people who liked anti-austerity politics, young people who joined the party, people who broadly shared Labour values, who looked at this guy, so this guy is sincere, he believes what he says, he wants to change politics, and he wants to mend our broken communities. And it was no more complex than that, than just people liked him and his policies. But there's this kind of boogeyman of the Trotskyist entryist, which kind of was a big kind of misdirection within the press and within the halls of the Labour right. And really, most people in the pie, they really do still like him quite a lot.
The polling on it's really interesting, actually. He's not immensely popular with the public, but Jeremy Corbyn still is more popular than Tony Blair, David Cameron, Jeremy Hunt, David Lammy. But apparently he's so toxic. So is Jeremy Corbyn likely to win his Islington North seat on July the 4th? He's held it since 1983, and he enjoyed a 26,000 majority in the last general election. Corbyn is also renowned for being a hard-working constituency MP, a reputation that will serve him well when it comes to canvassing. But as an independent, he's up against a powerful Labour machine, especially in London. They're standing a candidate who couldn't be further from the former Labour leader. A 33-year-old Praful Nargund is a former Labour councillor in the area. And until recently, he was the CEO of a chain of private IVF clinics. ABC IVF was founded by Nargund and his mother, Professor Geeta Nargund, in 2017. He would have been 26 years old, offering low-cost fertility treatments both in the private sector and via NHS trusts. Before that, his mother founded Create Fertility, a chain of IVF clinics, while Praful was its CEO. In 2021, Create, as well as ABC IVF, was sold in the biggest deal in the 40-year history of the British IVF industry. The buyer was US firm Iverma, the largest reproductive healthcare corporation in the world. So what's the big deal? Well, Create Fertility's website tells us this. Working with the NHS across England, Create Fertility hold contracts with the NHS ICBs, the organisations who decide how local NHS budgets are spent in most regions across England. If we hold a contract with your local ICB, you can be referred to our clinics for NHS-funded IVF treatment, which is delivered in line with NICE guidelines. That's right. Thanks to the Nargund's sale of their chain of clinics that held NHS contracts, a large US private healthcare corporation is now receiving funds from the NHS. That means the UK government is paying to outsource some fertility treatments to a giant multinational based offshore. Does it pay tax here? You tell me, probably not. Presumably, Praful Nargund got quite rich from this sale, although we can't find any record of his wealth. But a holding company that lists Geeta Nargund as current director and Praful Nargund as director until December last year shows a profit of over £16 million in 2021, the year that sale went through. If that fortune was made by the sale of Create Fertility, it was money made by opening up NHS patients to US corporate healthcare. Of course, that's exactly in keeping with the likely future Health Secretary Wes Streeting's ideas for the NHS. He said he wants to increase the access that private companies have to our national healthcare system. Helena, there's so much to talk about here. We have to stop the privatisation of the NHS by making this guy an MP. And by the way, he sold a company which has NHS contracts to the US, but don't talk about that for too long. There's also, of course, the point about Britain's economic model, where we just sell all our companies off to the US, primarily the US actually. They re-domicile for tax reasons elsewhere. The profits flow out, we might call them rents even, flow out. They create opportunities for others abroad, and actually is a big part of why Britain over the last 20 years has got much poorer. If you want to know more about that, I did I think, great interview with Angus Hanton. He was great, not me, about basically Britain being taken over, captured by US corporate interests. This is of a part of that. And yet, Helena, one of the people at the centre of it is a Labour Party candidate, and nobody in the media seems to think that's remotely important.
I mean, it almost feels like it's performative by Labour HQ going, yeah, we got rid of the socialist and look who we're replacing him with. Look at this healthcare CEO. Aren't you triggered, leftists? Now, I don't think that's necessarily the case. But what it does show you, what it really does show you, is it's indicative of what we've spoken about a lot on the channel, which is this idea of like the managerial class's takeover, their recapturing of the Labour Party, where it's stuffing the list of MPs full of lobbyists and people with connections to industry and people from consultancies, all these people who have connections that they need, professional connections to high-paying people in industry, for example, as a replacement for the people who were traditionally supposed to be the representatives of the working class in Parliament, which is the Labour Party. There was a really interesting post by Tides of History on Twitter the other day, talking specifically that there were this list of people who were Labour Party candidates, including the lawyers and the gentry, but also had farmers on the list. There's no chance of that happening nowadays. And we've seen this. We've seen this in the kind of people who get taken off shortlists. We've spoken many times, people with trade union backing, with multiple trade unions backing them, who've been completely snubbed on putting on Labour shortlists to be an MP, because that's not who they want. The Sean Halsalls, the Lauren Townsends, the Lee Drennans of this world. They're not allowed to be Labour MPs. It might damage their brand being the pro-business Labour Party, and it also is less useful to them politically than having people who have all of these different connections to private healthcare firms or indeed the privatised water industry, which is far more useful to them than somebody that might be an optical problem for them down the line. And this kind of internal war with what should be a party that represents the trade unions in Parliament is clearly seen by the kind of people we have in the background. There are plenty of people within the right wing of the Labour Party that would much rather there was no union affiliation in the party and it became just another bourgeois party. And then they could have all of these representatives who are handpicked by people at the top of the party, have all these connections to industry that's necessary for them, for the political machinations in the background, without having to worry about having to do all of these stitch-ups, having to remove union-backed candidates from diluting the strength of what they perceive to be the strength of the Parliamentary Labour Party and having all of these connections to lobbying industries and, of course, the private industries as well.
Yeah, it's almost like, I can imagine Luke Akehurst and Keir Starmer and Morgan McSweeney in a little lab. If they were to come up with the perfect candidate, he's BAME, he has beautiful white teeth, he's early 30s, private healthcare, slick, nice looking, perfect. And like you say, private healthcare, privatisation of NHS services has been something of a disaster. Probably not as disastrous as private water. There are people standing as candidates for Labour who've been lobbyists for private water companies. And by the way, when they talk about their CV, they say, I've been involved in campaigning around water. What they don't say is, you were campaigning for the private water companies. Southern Water, Thames Water. Really astonishing. They view, the Labour High Command views modernity, slickness, competence, professionalism. If you're in that world, shafting the country, shafting everybody who pays a water bill, if you're in that world, you're one of us. What does that say about politics? Faiza Shaheen is standing as an independent in the constituency of Chingford and Woodford Green. That's after she was suddenly blocked from running for Labour by the party's bigwigs. But now, Shaheen's campaign has gained a boost, with the man widely viewed as the greatest snooker player of all time, Ronnie O'Sullivan, yes, the GOAT, giving her an endorsement.
I'm actually fangirling in such a big way right now. I've been a huge fan of yours and just watching snooker for a really long time.
I love this area. I think it's one of the most amazing communities that I've ever experienced. I'm a big community person, and I just feel that we've got a special thing going on around here in Woodford, and I just think it needs a local person that's in touch with local people, knows what's right for the community. There are things that are not good around here, so we need someone that is going to push to get these things done. And I know Faiza has lived around here all her life, went to school here, and is a massive part of the community, and she knows what's right for this community. I'm a great believer in people that have passion. They'll drive things through, a lot more strongly, and I just think that someone without passion, dictating what goes on around this area isn't going to be good for the locals. So for me, it's about engaging in this stuff and supporting someone that knows this area really well. So passion is a massive thing. I think Faiza has bundles of it, and she just wants what's great for this community. So, for me, it's a no-brainer. So I'm definitely going to be voting for Faiza, and I want all of you out there to be voting for Faiza as well, because I know that she wants what's right for the community. So if you care about your community, then get behind Faiza.
Go on, Ronnie O'Sullivan. That's a political 147 if there is one. O'Sullivan, who lives in the constituency, has been world snooker champion 7 times. And in 2017, he joined the Labour Party to support Jeremy Corbyn's bid to be the next Prime Minister. Look, the media loves to say that nobody liked the guy in 2017. Everybody hated Labour. Actually, there was lots of this stuff. I remember, including from celebs, backing Labour. We don't hear about it, of course, because the state-sanctioned establishment, media, political class, they don't like him. So, of course, that never happened. What I like about this is that somebody down on their luck, Faiza Shaheen, who's been really treated very badly, mistreated very badly, still gets a hand up from Ronnie O'Sullivan. I think that says a great deal about the man. Of course, if you're similarly inspired, you can get involved with Faiza Shaheen's campaign. Remember, she's not just up against the Labour Party, but also the Tories too. It could be something of a three-way marginal. We have no idea, frankly, because, of course, this is a Tory seat in Duncan Smith, but the Tory vote is in freefall. We don't know how much. We don't know how much of a misstep it is by Labour. And, of course, Faiza Shaheen, very popular, very able, but she hasn't had very long to build a machine. She hasn't got the data. And that really counts, by the way. You can win the vote on the day, but not win because you didn't do postal votes 2 weeks before. That stuff really, really matters. But it's all to play for. And I really think that's nice from Ronnie O'Sullivan. Has he snookered Labour in Chingford? Who knows? Helena, thank you for joining me on tonight's show. And thanks everyone for watching. Make sure to come back tomorrow evening for another stream. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.